Welcome to today's WRR lecture with the theme Open Society, its old enemies and its new friends. For I say nothing new with the observation that we're living in a time of complex and profound changes, an ever-expanding globalization, the ongoing move of immigrants to Western societies, the opportunities but also risks of a world connected by digital means, and of course, democratic values at stake in countries that are even part of the European Union. These and other changes clearly have an effect on core values that underlie what has been described by Karl Popper in his book, Open Societies, the 1945 book. In that book, Popper contrasted open societies with closed ones. Closed societies leave no room for voice and have closed borders in various interpretations of that word. An open society, in contrast, is one that encourages rational reflection, gives individuals the freedom and responsibility to think for themselves. It is based, above all, on democracy, equality, and faith in reason. Ladies and gentlemen, turning a blind eye to the many changes we face in today's society or simply close our very minds to them is no longer an option. Friends and enemies of the open society are among us, even in the Netherlands. This very week is illustrative with the controversy surrounding Black Piet, Zwarte Piet. As you know, our traditional Dutch celebration of Santa Claus, Sinterklaas, and in particular the character of Black Piet, Zwarte Piet. It testifies of the collusion between open and closed societies, the motivations of those who value the traditions that come with this children party, considering its origins, history, and practices. And on the other hand, the motivations of those that claim that Black Piet is racist. Whatever perspective you take, an open society allows for a debate between these two perspectives. A closed society is a society where people erect a roadblock, as individuals did last week in the northern part of our country, and thus preventing people from freely articulating their perspective in the debate. And that is illustrative for an attack on the virtues of an open society. A closed society is a society where the state does not act upon such a violation, the right to demonstrate. Hence, it's not difficult to point to clashes close by. And we can all think of other examples that point to various other clashes. And thus, we can no longer downplay the significance of phenomena and their relation to the open society. We cannot downplay the need for friends, perhaps even new friends, in upholding core values of an open society, and the role and responsibility of various actors, ranging from media, academia, civil society, and the state. I think it's time to invite our keynote speaker, our lecturer, to come to the floor. Professor Ignatieff, may I ask you to come to the stage?
Thanks so much. It's a great honor to be here. I was looking at the list of all the distinguished people in the audience and thought, well, for 2 hours, the Dutch government's going to come to a complete standstill here. So I'm very flattered that you're here, and I thank you very much. And as for the word cloud, I was kind of hoping, I was rooting for love in the list of words, but it seems to have been crowded out by freedom in the word cloud, so there you go. Anyway, if you think about what the ideal of an open society is, you kind of come with 4 ideas, it seems to me. The first claim is an epistemological one. Closed societies define the truth of their people. Open societies leave the determination of truth to a free process of scientific falsification. The distinctive feature of Popper's version of liberal democracy is that it put its emphasis on the epistemological basis of what we do. We allow free deliberation to determine public policy and and democratic choice. And the epistemological claim is clearly in trouble because we're in this thing called the post-truth society. So the epistemological foundations of liberal democracy are challenged as never before. I think the second aspect of open society is a political claim, which is that closed societies favor mass coercion, single-party domination. Open societies privilege a politics that Popper called piecemeal social engineering. And the miracle that is Western liberal prosperity since 1945 is the result of piecemeal social engineering, by which I mean learning from your mistakes. God knows we've made mistakes getting to the Netherlands of 2017, but we got there with piecemeal social engineering, massive public debate, resistance argument, and incrementally we produce this enormous edifice of wealth. But that piecemeal social engineering leaves people enormously discontented. Where's the vision? Where is the radiant tomorrow? Where is the bright horizon? I'm a big fan, being an old-style liberal, of piecemeal social engineering, but let's not neglect the discontent it leaves behind. The third claim, I think, about open society is a moral claim, which is liberal societies are societies that care about individuals' retail. Individuals matter. We talk a lot about diversity and difference, but the difference that we care about morally is the difference between each of you in the room. And that, the value we give to individuals is essentially the moral claim that sustains liberal democracy. The final claim is a historical claim. One of the things that open societies and liberal democracy have said for themselves with particular confidence in the 70s and 80s was that in the long run, open societies would prevail over closed ones. That is, there was a tacit historical narrative in the post-45 world that open societies would eventually win out. And if I think there's one thing that's got us troubled in 2017, it's suddenly a doubt, particularly posed by China and other closed societies, as to whether that historical narrative remains true. So those are the claims that essentially undergird a liberal society: epistemological, political, moral, and historical. But there's another thing we need, I think, to say, which is open society itself has changed enormously since 1945. The open society that Karl Popper took for granted in 1945 when he was writing is unimaginable or unrecognizable to us now. It was a society of rationing, exchange controls, nationalized industries, confiscatory rates of taxation, mobilization for reconstruction, strongly national cultures, strongly monoethnic societies, and held together by, on the one hand, the memory of fascism and the totalitarian threat in the future. And that's a very different situation for open societies. Now we look at a very different open society with free movement of capital, hyper-migration, hyper-connectivity, hyper-diversity, a state that is in some sense, thanks to the neoliberal revolution, less strong and interventionist than it was in 1945. Much higher levels of inequality in 2017 than the wartime mobilizations in the 1940s. Much more oligopoly. Open societies trying to find their bearings and their cultural space in a globalized culture. And this convulsion of change, I think, has produced within open society a deep nostalgia for the open society of the past, which was in fact a much more closed society than we are used to now. If open societies have claimed, it's also the case that closed societies have changed enormously. If you think of the closed society of 1945, it was autarky, socialism in one country, sealed frontiers, no exit, no voice, and loyalty based on coercion, to use Albert Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty distinctions. If you flash forward to 2017, our closed societies are unrecognizably different. They've been inserted into the global capitalist economy. They function on what could be called rule by law as opposed to rule of law. Crucially, they allow exit but no voice, and a loyalty based on nationalism. But these are very different than the Soviet communist regimes or the Chinese communist regimes that we faced in the Cold War. And one of the elements that I think is most difficult in thinking about the future of open society is the collusive relationship between open societies in 27 and closed societies. To a degree that we need to that pose the biggest questions in international relations and international security is whether open societies are essentially maintaining closed societies. Think about it for a minute. Chinese capitalism allows anybody who's unhappy with the internal party regime to offshore their resources in Vancouver or Amsterdam or London. Anybody who is unhappy with Hungary can exit through Schengen. These open and closed societies are in a collusive, mutually dependent relationship, which poses huge questions for international relations. Should we buy market access in China in return for allowing, essentially, the stability of single-party rule in China? Have we made our bed with a state capitalist authoritarianism in China? This kind of regime, precisely because it has insertion into the capitalist world, may be much more stable. It may have a much longer future in the 21st century than the closed societies that we thought we'd beaten after 1989. The same dilemma is posed by the illiberal democracies in Eastern Europe, Hungary and Poland. These societies are parasitic on the openness of Western Europe. But Western Europe faces a dilemma. If they enforce a community of values, if they say Europe has to stand for something, there's a risk that these two societies and many other societies in Eastern Europe will simply back out of the club. So we have the dilemma of, can we bring them back into the fold of genuinely open societies? Or is there a risk that when we do so, we precipitate them further on the trajectory of becoming a closed society? So these issues of collusion between open and closed societies are not usually posed, but they seem to me to be critical to the future of the international relations of liberal democracies as a whole. Another way to think about the relationship between open and closed societies is the other side of the coin, which is the ways in which closed societies are now directly intervening in our own democracies. Nobody can look at the cyber interference in the election processes in Western Europe and in the United States without having deep alarm at the ways in which closed societies are now intervening and manipulating and trying to shape public opinion in open ones. And this raises questions about how we manage cyberspace and the internet, and whether we can do so consistent with our own valued freedoms. How do we safeguard, literally, the integrity of our democracies through the 21st century? Seems to me a question we're now fumbling to find answers for. The challenge to open societies don't stop there. Need to say, I hardly need to mention the fact that the vision of an open society is challenged by the border question. Almost everybody, if asked, in our democratic publics, when asked, do you like the idea of an open society, they say, sure, we like an open society, but we'd like closed borders. And so we're living in that contradiction. Openness and human rights, a similar conflict. The majoritarian populism we're seeing sweeping through the world is increasingly resistant to international human rights invigilation from the outside. As you know, I come from a perfect country, Canada, a country without blemish. But even we resent external human rights invigilation of some of the domestic problems we have, and that resentment at outside invigilation of open societies grows with every day, and it's not just anymore confined to closed societies. The resentment is very strong in open societies as well. Another conflict, I'm raising questions rather than answers. I think I'll have the odd answer later on, I hope. One of the other challenge about an open society goes back to the first point I made, which is that these societies have an epistemological basis. We believe in a marketplace of ideas. We believe that facts are stubborn things. Facts are objective. Facts can be found. Why does WRR exist? It exists because it believes there is such a thing as a fact. They do believe that Mr. Rutte, your prime minister, would decide a little better if he decided on the basis of facts. So the rationale of the whole outfit is based on a certain epistemology. And yet, there's no question that the authority of the scientific people in this room is challenged as never before. We all know the Brexit, Mr. Gov's infamous remark about the people being tired of experts. But this is a challenge to professional authority and professional expertise that challenges the legitimacy of everybody in this room, including me. And it results in a strong kind of anti-empirical majoritarianism in which the test of truth is what a majority believe to be true. And that is a recurrent challenge to democracy in all ages, but I never expected in my lifetime to see that challenge to be as strong, persistent, and angry and ressentiment-filled as it is now. And that must connect to the fact that the professionals who have scientific authority, the professionals who have authority based on their expertise, are doing extremely well financially. So resentment, epistemologically based resentment, is also connected to class resentment in a mixture which is potentially toxic, frankly, for all of us. And there's another challenge as well, which relates to what I said earlier about the ways in which closed societies are manipulating our democracy. There's some challenges inside to democracy that we need to think about. You could almost ask whether open society is destroying democracy. That's a provocative question. It can't be true, but there's some element of it that is disturbingly true at the moment. If you look at what the digital revolution has done to democracy, the digital revolution is premised on openness, on frontierless digital communications. But it's having a couple of effects that we're all struggling to think about. One of them is what I would call virtual disinhibition. Let me tell you a story from my political life. As you know, I was fantastically successful in politics, so I got an opportunity to lecture you about politics at length. But one of the things I noticed in politics is that I shook many thousands of hands in the 5 years that I had my triumphant political career. And precisely because it was so triumphant, one of the things I learned is that I never had a disagreeable word with any fellow citizen when I was face to face. Astoundingly, the rules of decorum prevailed in democracy. The internet was something else. It was so awful that my wife said, "You're not going to survive if you click on any links referring to you. You'll curl up and die." So that's an example of what I would call virtual disinhibition. We've unleashed a monster in our politics, which is anonymous comment on the internet. The disinhibiting effect of anonymous comment is producing a kind of rage and hatred and contempt in politics, which used to be disciplined by the face-to-face interactions of the democratic agora. And so we're in a new situation. The other component of that, or related phenomenon, I would call algorithmic segregation. You may know it by the term filter bubbles. We're all increasingly prisoners, and we are as much prisoners as anybody else, of the bubbles of information within which we work. And the public space in which we make common decisions and share common factual bases for argument and policy determination is fragmenting. And one of the ways that I think, one of the things we need as policy professionals to avoid is the thought that we are not in a filter bubble, it's those poor other people who are. Folks, let's wake up. We're all in a filter bubble. My filter bubble just happens to have the New York Times in it, but let's not assume, or you have, the Volkskrant or whatever it is. We're all in filter bubbles, and this is reducing our capacity for the rough shared experience, the rough sense of common fate on which a democratic politics depends. All of this has been accompanied, as I said earlier, by an attack on expertise. An open society is creating enormous amounts of cultural anxiety, almost a sense that open society is a contradiction in terms, because a society has to have boundaries. Where are the boundaries here? Where are the boundaries in terms of culture? Where are the boundaries in terms of language? Where are the boundaries in terms of frontier? I'm very struck by the sense of cultural anxiety that is alive across Western democracies, and is wrongly dismissed by experts and sophisticated people like us as if it's an anxiety that only they have. I think the anxiety is much more widely and generally shared. One of the phenomena, again, that's taught everybody by surprise is that open society was premised on an idea of open markets. Free trade, international free trade, to a degree that's caught everybody by surprise. Suddenly, free trade is not working for broad swaths of democratic electorates. And this is producing an extraordinarily turbulent condition in which the founders of open society, people like Popper, people like Schumpeter, talked about the creative destruction of capitalism, and now people feel only that the destruction is anything but creative. So the very defense of an open international economy has come into question as never before. One additional feature, I'm giving you nothing but the negative story. Believe me, before I sit down, and I'll sit down in a minute or two, I hope I can end on a more positive note. When you put all these phenomena together, one of the things I noticed in again, my brilliant political career is the ways in which across Western democracies we've replaced, perhaps less so in the Netherlands because you have coalition politics and a different electoral system, perhaps less in Germany, but in many other countries we've replaced a politics of adversaries with a politics of enemies. Adversary is a person you oppose today and you ally with tomorrow. An enemy is someone who wants to destroy you. We've created a politics of enemies. American politics is a politics of enemies. People, you don't simply oppose them. They oppose everything that you believe in and stand for, and they must be destroyed. That politics of enemies is tremendously destructive of democracy, because one of the unstated premises of democracy is someone who loses an election today could win it the day after tomorrow. And one of the geniuses of democracy is that it finds a way to handle loss as well as victory, so that those who lose stay in the game in the hopes that they can win. And that dynamic is sustained by the logic of adversaries, not enemies. And we are creating a politics of enemies which is deeply destructive of the political fabric, and also divisive and destructive of the social fabric as well. And one of the phenomenon of the politics of enemies that is of the greatest concern is the ways in which a politics of enemies is doing what I would call confiscating the virtues. I now have a short political plug for my book called The Ordinary Virtues. Normal services now resume, plug over. The confiscation of virtue refers to something I think we've all seen from 2015 to 2017 in Europe. Spontaneous demonstrations of compassion, mercy, solidarity, and friendship in the in September 2015 by populations who, for example, flooded to railway stations to aid and assist refugees, has been replaced by a language of border closing and shutting off the frontier and shutting out strangers, which I think the way to understand it is that it's a confiscation of generosity, compassion, and mercy by political language. If you live in the country I live in, it would be easy to think that Hungarians lack mercy, compassion, and generosity, because the unrelenting discourse from the top is to show compassion, mercy, or solidarity to anybody who's not a Hungarian is a betrayal of being Hungarian. Generosity has been recoded as betrayal. This is what I mean by the confiscation of virtue, and it is fatal to a country. It is fatal to a country because it's ultimately corrosive of the generosity, compassion, and mercy necessary to the internal cohesion of a society. So all of this, virtual disinhibition, algorithmic segregation, the attack on expertise, the weakening support for open markets, the empowerment of a politics of enemies versus a politics of adversaries, culminating in the confiscation of the virtues. We're in a tough time, folks. I sometimes think I've given you a kind of cold shower down your neck. I'm actually fiercely optimistic about the future of liberal democracy. You wouldn't know it from what I've said. But I actually think the only way to get to optimism is to look it squarely in the face and some of the problems. What do I conclude? And I really will conclude quickly. If you go back to the Open Society of 1945, one of the things you realize is how much Popper's vision of an open society depended on a strong sovereign state. It was not the open society of neoliberal openness. These were open societies that were sovereign. Sovereignty requires strong states, capable states, states with tax capacity, states with the capacity to coerce, states with the capacity to collaborate with others. This is not a paean to Brexit, let me tell you. You can't be a strong state in the modern world unless you collaborate with others. I think the Netherlands has understood how their own sovereignty is integrally dependent on European integration. But a strong state is only a strong state to the degree that it creates equal starting conditions for all citizens, for the sake of inclusion, for the sake of cohesion. But also strong states are states that control their borders. Again, a message from the perfect country, Canada. Our famous generosity and welcome for refugees and migrants is premised on border control. You can't have generosity for strangers unless you can tell your own citizens your borders are under control. That's how it works in the modern world. A strong state is the condition of compassion and generosity, not its reverse. Strong states in the modern world will have to control cyberspace for the existential reason that if they don't control cyberspace, they won't be able to preserve the integrity of their own democracy. I don't know how to do it, folks, but this seems to me an extremely urgent public policy problem. Almost to last, strong states need strong citizens. People like you, participatory, demanding, informed, difficult. They show up at meetings on rainy Thursday nights. They demand accountability. They push states to perform. They don't sit out elections. They come and vote. The culture of civic engagement and participation is crucial to a strong state. People who think strong state means weak citizens don't understand. You only have strong states when you have strong citizens. And finally, almost my last word, strong states need strong institutions. Free media, free courts, free professions, free universities. One of the terrible discoveries of defending a free institution in a place like Hungary, is the only way I can get leverage on the Hungarian government is from the outside, going to Washington, going to Berlin, going to Brussels, going to The Hague, because the domestic institutions have been decisively weakened by 7 or 8 years of single-party majoritarian rule. Without strong institutions, you can't have strong states. It's not a contradiction to have a strong state and have a strong media, strong courts, strong countervailing institutions. This is, it seems to me, points us in the direction of a very different vision of open society, in which open society is conditional on sovereignty, conditional on states with the capacity to enforce and defend the conditions of life for their citizens. Thank you so much for your attention.
Let me introduce Harun Shaikh to you, who will deliver our column. Perhaps well known already to many of us, director of the Freedom Lab, a think tank. You teach philosophy at the Free University, and of course you're a columnist at NRC Handelsblad, written a book, first in Dutch, and to be published soon as an English version, The Rise of the East. Thanks very much for joining us for your column. The floor is to you.
Thank you. Many years ago, as a young student, I read The Open Society and Its Enemies. And I have to admit, I found the book strange. Karl Popper's book appeared in 1945 as the Second World War was in its final act. And he didn't write about military mobilization, about the Great Depression or geopolitical rivalry. Instead, he wrote about ideas. In 2 volumes, he traced totalitarian movements to modes of thought in Hegel, Marx, and even Plato. At the time, this seemed to me like another philosopher exaggerating the relevance of his own field of expertise. But thinking about the current threats to the open society, there might be more to it than that. In our digital age, it is all about the battle of ideas. We now also face threats from closed societies abroad. These are, however, much less tangible than they were in the past. No foreign military provides us with an existential threat like in Popper's time. No powerful country adheres to an ideology of violent struggle. Yes, there's North Korea. It remains a closed society mobilized for war, and its nuclear threat is real. But it is a strange remnant of a black and white world that has come to pass. The real threat from foreign powers is much more subtle, because it involves a battle of ideas, and this battle is tailored to our use of social media. But neither foreign nor domestic actors that promote radical beliefs are, in my view, the most formidable challenge to the open society. A more serious threat than radical belief is the gentle undermining caused by disbelief. Digital media have covered society with a thick mist of doubt. Conspiracy theories, fake news, and alternative facts surround our public sphere. More than fearing this will convince us of something, I fear it will make us cynical. The thick mist has transformed the mass media into a media mass where everything depends on perspective. Heroes become villains and villains can become heroes. Science becomes an opinion among others, and its knowledge on climate change, child vaccination, and nutrition is undermined by amateurs. Skepticism about our public institutions is the greatest threat to the open society. It is a subtle threat, because instead of attacking it from the outside, it erodes the open society from the inside. And it is easy to imagine this situation getting worse. Behind me is an image of a software program that is trained with voice samples and facial patterns of Barack Obama. This program can now make him say anything we want, indistinguishable from the real thing. This dangerous technology already exists, and more is on the horizon. The so-called Internet of Things promises to make our physical world smart. But it also means that we can graft our filter bubbles onto the physical world. Imagine real-life subtitles wherever we go, telling us to evade people or places that do not fit with the beliefs we have. Our open society would then splinter into 17 million closed societies. As citizens get lost in the midst of the internet, we require a policy response, and I believe that that is possible. Let me end by giving a suggestion based on an analogy. Throughout history, new technologies like trains and cars have made us more mobile. This has opened up new spaces and also presented us with new dangers. This is what Professor Ignatieff referred to as the openness that threatens to challenge democracy itself. But in the past, with specific policies, we managed to mitigate the dangers of these wild open spaces. Infrastructure critical for our safety, in time were regulated like utilities. Passports and license plates created accountability for the anonymous users. Speed limits and safety belts protected us against dangerous behavior. And for victims, we developed insurance. So my question is, can we come up with the digital equivalent of passports, speed limits, and safety belts?
Thanks, Harold. And wonderful that you were willing to come and write and speak the column. Lydia, may I ask you to come to the floor? Ladies and gentlemen, Lydia Vlachsma, student as said, student at Radboud University, Nijmegen, for those of you who don't know. But so here she is going to moderate the panel, and the floor is to you, and you're to invite the other panel members as well.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Corinne. Thank you, Michael Ignatieff, for your very thought-provoking lecture. I would like to invite the other panelists to the floor so they can take their places already. And in the meantime, I will explain what we will be doing during this part of the lecture. As we've heard in both Michael Ignatieff's lecture as well as in the column of Harun Shaikh, the battle of ideas or the public debate is crucial in an open society, and therefore it is also crucial that debate is part of this meeting. So therefore, we have invited these 4 panelists to discuss open society in more detail and also to specifically apply it to the situation in the Netherlands. So what we will do in this discussion is address 4 blocks or themes that have probably already been touched upon in the lecture of Dr. Ignatieff and the column of Harun Shaikh. So the first block will be politics in the traditional sense, in the state sense, the Hague politics and international politics. The second block will be the new friends of open society, so the institutions that can support it. And the third block will be the closest to home. It will address community building and identity formation and how open society translates into that close to home process. But first, the panel members. So first, Michael Ignatieff, you have already met and listened to. We're very happy to have you here in the panel as well as on the lecture, so welcome. Then secondly, Corinne Prins, you've already met her as well. She is here as a representative of academia and science. She's already mentioned that she's a professor in law and technology, a former dean of law school in Tilburg, and is also in the advisory board of the NWO. So that is why she's here today. Then to the left of her is Marcia Luiten. She is here to represent the media as a supportive, as a friend of open society. She has over 20 years of experience as a journalist. Most of you probably know her from Buitenhof. She is also a best-selling author with her novel Het Geluk van Limburg, which is about the decline of the mining industry in the south of the Netherlands. So that is why you are here. And then finally, there's Lilian Gonzalez. She is the former president of Amnesty International in the Netherlands, and is currently active. She is active as a lawyer and a human rights activist in the Netherlands still. So we're very happy to have all these panelists here to have a discussion. So give them a warm applause, please. So before starting the discussion, I would like to invite the panelists to this podium to give an opening statement, or I will ask them an opening question to which they can respond. So I would first like to invite Lilian to give your opening statement. Thank you.
Dear guests, open society, its old enemies and its new friends. Corinne Prince made a fantastic opening speech already, and there she mentioned that it's almost Sinterklaas. And I'm going to do the same. I'm not going to skip it, because it is something also personal. I'm also part of a minority, and every year when Sinterklaas is coming, there is around us a fierce discussion going on. That is fine. But for that reason, I also feel personally involved to share some ideas which are not personal with you. I'm also a lawyer. In a critical column in the Volkskrant of November 21st on the anti-peat demonstrations last weekend, Sinan Sankaya concluded, resistance begins obviously in a bus. Is this reference to the resistance of Rosa Parks, a black lady who on December 1955 refused to give up her seat assigned to black people in the backside of the bus? Conclusion from this incident is that the state did not protect anti-peat demonstrators who acted in a lawful manner. Moreover, no pro-peat demonstrator has been arrested. Even if the government had a valid reason to cancel the demonstration for security reasons, disturbance of the public order is not a valid excuse for not arresting pro-peat demonstrators. They acted against the law and created a dangerous situation by blocking public roads and inciting a riot. And by not acting, the government may use concern about impartiality. In this difficult area of massive terrorist attacks, it is understandable that states take more and more preventive measures to control and minimize risks. However, governments should not curb demonstration and protest too easy in the name of public order. By doing that, they maintain the status quo, which mostly favors the position of those in power. Voices of minorities might get lost in this process. Open society should protect the right of individuals to peaceful demonstrations, to freedom of speech within the boundaries of the law. Protection, however, requires in the first place some basic knowledge of human rights and of the Constitution. One of the findings of the Staatscommissie Grondwet in 2010 was that knowledge of the constitutional order in the Netherlands is very limited. Therefore, the Commission recommended paying systematically more attention in education to the principles of the organization of the public administration, the nature of democratic rule of law, and knowledge of fundamental and human rights. This recommendation was not related to citizens only, but also explicitly to the government itself and its office holders. This includes police officers. Question is, what the role of the state should be in safeguarding fundamental rights in an open society. Is it only respecting and protecting them, or does it also pertain facilitating and enhancing them? With regard to freedom of speech and pluriformity of media, the Commission observed that the provision to protect pluriformity of information may lead a government to be actively involved in deciding which forms of pluriformity are admissible. That is, however, primarily a concern of civil society, for the citizens themselves to keep pluriformity of opinions and points of view alive. Taking into account the risk involved of an obligation for government to act with regard to freedom of expression, the Commission advised not to include the provision to protect, but to respect the pluriformity of media. In the end, the protection of the open society is a concern and obligation for civil society itself. This requires well-informed, critical citizens willing to protest and demonstrate to defend their fundamental rights and those of others. The seeds of illiberal democracy are sown in open societies in which the fundamental rights and freedoms of some are ignored or willfully neglected.
Thank you very much for that opening statement. I would now like to turn to Marcia Luijten to ask her for her opening words in response to the question. We've all heard how important strong media are to protect an open society, but what are its current and most important threats?
Thank you, Lydia. Yes, I've been asked to make a few remarks about media in this post-truth era. I remember when I was doing my education as a journalist, I was at the Volkskrant, I was taught this really important thing, that there was a method to try to reach an agreement on facts. And this method it's called adversarial reporting. In Dutch, that is hoor en wederhoor. It means you've got to try to be even-handed, to hear all sides of a conflict. And it also means something else. It also means that as a journalist, you're independent and you're always controlling those who are in power. Those are the two meanings of that adversarial reporting. Well, today I find it's getting harder to reach a consensus on the facts. And you also find that is also because not everybody now automatically adheres to the same rules of the game. So there are two problems here. One is the filter bubble that Professor Ignatieff also already mentioned. And in that filter bubble, it's very hard to get to even-handed reporting that takes into account all the sides. Another thing is that you see there's a diminishing respect of one of the founding pillars of our liberal democracy, and that is the independent press. That brings me to a very, very important question, a question that also Professor Ignatieff raised: how to manage cyberspace. I think we should seriously examine what can a state do to prevent ill-intended fake news to disrupt our democratic order. Can fake news, if it is proven that it is spread with ill intent, can that become legally punishable? Yeah, and I can imagine that now lawyers are thinking like, oh my God, that sounds like censorship. To me, it doesn't. I think we have to dare look for rules in a new game of which we haven't set yet clear boundaries. We're now on a play field on which we are already behind. It's not about censorship, according to me. This is about 21st century warfare, soft warfare, and we need tools to defend ourselves. Maybe we need less tanks and other fierce combat devices, less than ICT experts, excellent prosecutors and good lawyers. That was the second remark. Then, what makes these things worse is this fragmentation of our worldview. That's what Professor Ignatieff referred to, talking about this algorithmic segregation. more and more we lack a common point of reference on how we perceive the world around us. I think most media are broadcasting to and are writing for the like-minded. This is something we should be really, really alert on, that the aggression that we're threatened with, that we withdraw from it and we try to take the exit rather than confronting it and defend fundamental rights. And then my fifth remark, and maybe that's an overarching problem. A huge problem with media, I think, is that news has become a commercial product. And as a commercial product, it can undermine democracy. I think it's especially this business model, driven by clicks and likes and hypes and emotions, that has brought Donald Trump to power and Brexit to Europe. And you see that our commercialized information environment, it really feeds on sort of primitive needs. I mean, I think man, in the end, is, he prefers sugar and fat to nuts and vegetables. So the same is with the information you consume. You'd rather read something that is emotional and that is a hype than reading a very complex feature. And this also leads to scandalizing news. And the major question is, can we leave the production of news, the production of facts, to the market? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcia, for those remarks. As a third opening remark point, I would like to invite Corinne Prins to share with us a little bit on how you experience diversity, which is often also a value associated with open society, and how you experienced the struggle that comes with diversity, being the first female dean in your university in Tilburg, and also maybe more in general what happens at universities and academia. So I would like to invite you to the podium as well.
And let me relate that to academia. As universities, and broader than that, societal partners as well, you might remember that we initiated the so-called Nationale Wetenschapsagenda. Quite an effort in order to bring society and academia a bit closer to one another. Also as part of a broader ambition of the universities to be a bit more in interaction with society. All those peer-reviewed international publications read by 10 fellow academics, are they still relevant, or should we as universities relate much more to society? So the Nationale Wetenschapsagenda, many different questions raised by society and brought onto the agenda of academia. But since then it has been silent. And I still have the feeling that we as academia are still a bit anonymous for society. And it is easy to criticize academia and in that way relate to one another, academia and society, in that virtual world. Because we do not see each other, we do not truly understand each other, too anonymous. So linking between academia and society, trying to deal with the sentiment in society that it is just an opinion, it's not fact, it's just an opinion, has something to do with the very fact that science is much too far away from society. And when we take up the challenge of interacting with society, we do that for a one-time moment, but then draw again behind the curtains and do not relate with society, or not enough. At least that's my impression. Nevertheless, I also see that there are challenges there, difficulties there, but much more openness, making ourselves understandable, making understandable why we do research, but also open for debate, much more than we do that now. And the final thing is media as a business model made me think of science as a business model, academia as a business model, the way we are financed today as universities, the competition that we face, the competition, the ERC grants and the NWO applications that we write as part of, you could say, a business model for universities. So that in the end also relates, and that's my final remark, with how society sees academia. So academia, no, I should finalize differently. Of course, you can ask from society to have a bit more understanding for the knowledge of academia and that it is much more than just an opinion. But on the other hand, I think that there's a responsibility for academia itself as well to have society feel a bit different.
Let me make a negative remark and a positive remark. Let me add to the negative remark by simply saying one of the things that Alexander Herzen, the great Russian socialist, said something that Isaiah Berlin loved and I've always loved. He said, the thing we have to remember is that history has no libretto. That is, history is not a song of freedom. History is just history. And that's important because I think there has been a kind of complacency about the future of liberal democracy. We're riding the wave of history. You know, the whole world is going to get to the Netherlands eventually, by which I mean everybody's going to imitate the Netherlands as a social model, or Denmark, or one of those great countries, or heaven help us, they might even imitate Canada, although that's very difficult. If you're perfect, it's, you know, almost impossible. And I just think that's not what's going to happen. The 21st century, there are many routes to the future. We cannot predict with confidence that Chinese state capitalism will fail. History doesn't work that way. We simply don't know. It means that we have to defend our societies without the certainty that we're riding a wave of history. That means we have to defend it more fiercely because we can lose it. I think one of the things about being in Hungary, a country I love, I married a Hungarian, I must like the place. Well, no, not necessarily, you're quite right, but I do like the place. Is that's something it teaches you. We bought into, I think Eastern Europeans bought into an idea of transition, which was a historical narrative. You start in a closed society, you end in an open society, hey presto, it's great. In fact, the transition goes on and on and on in very uncertain directions. But I think it's important for Western Europeans not to write Hungary off, to write Poland off, to think the story is over. We just don't know how it's going to end. And it's, I think, important for European solidarity that we help those democratic voices in Hungary and Poland, wherever, who are fighting. So that's the first point, is just, we could lose this, folks, so let's fight for it. History is not on our side, so that's kind of, you know, number one. Number two, and it relates to all the comments about media and also about universities. And here I am a rational optimist, and I think this is something that Popper is very helpful to think about. Facts are stubborn things. The climate is either heating up because of man-made emissions or it's not, right? A policy either works or it doesn't. You know, we can talk about post-truth forever, but eventually reality does make its choices, as it were. You either have a view of reality that illuminates and clarifies, or you don't. You can't be, the very good, our excellent column made the point about the mist. The mist, there is lots of mist out there. But certain things do turn out to be true because we falsify, we try stuff out and it doesn't work. We try policies, they don't work. We try pretending that climate change is not going to happen, and then we discover certain facts that seem irresistible. And that leads me to think that we don't need to believe that liberal democracy is going to be in the mist or the fog forever. Certain things prove out to be true. And Donald Trump's flagrant attempt to deny certain facts eventually, in my view, gets punished politically. There are consequences for perverse, persistent denial of obvious realities, right? And to that degree, I'm a rational optimist, because I think liberal democracies are full of the best educated people in the history of the world. That, I think, is historically true. This little machine contains the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria, and we all have one, right? We misuse them, we succumb to rubbish and nonsense. We're the best of them. But at the end of the day, certain things end up being true. And for that reason, I kind of feel when I get depressed myself, I say to myself, get a grip here. Reality is what it is, and reality teaches us infallibly what ends up being true in politics. And I, having lost an election, can tell you reality is a great teacher, right? And that's important. We're not in the mist forever, is what I'm saying.
Eventually, truth will prevail.
The biggest single challenge to open society, we're all painfully aware of it now, is 21st century migration. Mobility of capital looked pretty good after 1989. The Netherlands has profited greatly from the mobility of capital, but nobody really likes the infinite mobility of labor. And some people are refugees, clearly driven out by persecution, torture, war, and threats of violence. I think the international regimes that sustain those populations are still intact. I think if you asked ordinary Dutch citizens, should we provide refuge, and do we have an obligation to provide refuge to someone who is in fear of violent death, torture, or is the subject of a massacre or ethnic cleansing, the answer overwhelmingly, I think, still will be yes, and will be yes across many countries. The problem is what you're calling the fortune seekers, and there, the politics of migration depends on strengthening the language of the gift. That is, what works in Canada to a limited degree, let's not go overboard here, is the idea that we can give the gift of Canadian citizenship and a path to integration to a limited number of people at our discretion, consistent with border control. And because we're a very large country, we take in, almost the equivalent of 1% of population a year, which is not, that's the other point I'd make. There's no one size fits all here. There's no one open society model. What will work in Canada will not work here. What will work in the Netherlands will not work in Hungary. That's a feature of open society we need to understand, to respect national differences, national cultures, and national particularities. But the only political way to sustain a 21st century migration policy is to speak the language of the gift, not the language of rights, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the other thing to say is that what the public will not stand is illegal migration, because then you have a sense we've lost control. That's a threat to open society. No political system can survive having a sense that the borders are out of control. So you have to establish control of your borders, and that then means something else which is difficult, which is if you find illegals in the country, they have to be repatriated. That's really tough politics, and it's very nasty politics, and it has a lot of human rights problems, which are enormous. But you can't maintain the integrity of a society without repatriation, on the one hand. On the other hand, you have to have a legal migration stream. You've got to say to Nigerians, there are 160 Nigerians who arrived in Italy last year, you've got to say to Nigeria, there's a legal migration stream into Europe, and it's this number of people. Everybody else who comes in illegally goes back home to Nigeria, right? This is the rough politics of this.
Because of time reasons, I would like to move to maybe a slightly different topic, also already been pointed to in the various lectures and speakers, namely the role of experts. Many of us in the audience here are experts in some field, in policy making, or the 6 people who are experts in the media, according to the Mentimeter. I would like to ask you, maybe specifically Corinne Prins, how do you feel as a scientist about the eroding role of experts in our society because of the rise of alternative facts? And how can we gain trust again as experts from our society?
I think I already reflected a bit on this, in that I think it's crucial to be open to a conversation. That it's crucial to not too much think from your own position, in that the other party, from the position of academia, why doesn't society understand academia's academic freedom, etc. The biggest challenge is, I think, to have a true conversation. I'm a professor of law and technology. You just referred to cyberspace, to protection of cyberspace, protecting values, human rights in cyberspace, and on the other hand, sometimes closed borders in cyberspace. I see my role as an academic in sound academic research, to set certain steps, small steps there, but also not only to publish on all those results in the peer-reviewed international publications, but to have a debate with society, inspire society to use our insights in taking it further.
Well, let me first react a bit to what Corinne said, because what you say sounds beautiful, but it's also very abstract. So I'm immediately wondering, what do you mean? So conversation with whom, about what exactly?
I find it truly important to give lectures. For example, in Dutch, for the Vrouwenvereniging van Goorle. I live in the southern part of Netherlands. I find that crucial, worthwhile, because it gives my audience of 100 ladies in the southern part of the Netherlands a feeling what privacy is about, a feeling that privacy is something more than just a fundamental right in our constitution. And that may sound abstract, but during that presentation, I show them, like you just did, what that world is about. I make them, on the one hand, frightened, and on the other hand, offer them tools for their own unique position in that debate. I think that every individual can act in this debate, and that's the message I would like to bring then, and that makes it perhaps a bit less abstract.
Then still there remains this question that I just brought up, how to overcome this really serious divide between, say, us, public TV station, and the people who are hostile to us, who feel that the public television is an enemy to them and is culturally against everything that they stand for. And they get their news from the internet.
Sorry for interrupting, but do you think that, for example, the lecture that Corinne Prins would give would be a step to involve people who would normally not be in the right bubble, so to say?
Of course, yeah. Yeah, then you reach 100 people who might, normally not be in your science bubble, but now I was talking about the media, about my media bubble. This is, of course, a different bubble, and how could we reach people that are not yet converted? Yeah.
But it brings me to the next step, that we talked about states and their obligations and civil society, but there is also this elephant in the room of the big media companies that have the power. And in the old human rights struggle, you knew what to do about states. And I have the feeling that this is the same. We don't know exactly how to get to this power circle of the big media companies that brought you to be optimistic but had some doubts.
So, Michael, do you have any ideas maybe on this question?
Well, I have two thoughts. One of the reasons people like experts is that they talk down to people. They talk about people. They condescend to people. And in the wake of the Brexit events, for example, there was this, and in the wake of the Trump election, there was this kind of astonished discovery that there were millions of people who were disaffected, angry, excluded, deserted by the modern industrial economy, and never spoken to or talked to or listened to. And so, you know, in its weird way, I do think that democracy ground out a shocking result in Brexit and in Trump. Simply, it made the experts, the elites, the media, the professors, I'm including myself, in kind of shocked realization they didn't understand their damn society at all, actually. They didn't understand anything about it. And that's one of the functions of democracy, to shock us into waking up to the realities that because of our bubbles, because whatever, we don't tend to face. If you ask me why again, I think your distinction between hope and optimism is good. The reason I'm kind of hopeful but not optimistic, I'm going to line up with Havel here. That seems like the right team to be on. You know, I'm hopeful because this shock we've all had has been a shock about how little we understood and knew our societies. And it's humbling to so-called experts. I've been called an expert, and I realize there's a hell of a lot I just don't have the faintest idea about. So it's a humility cure, which seems to me a good thing. That's kind of number one. Number two, I mean, the rule of the road that it's taken me a lifetime to learn, and I often break the rule, is talk about what you actually know something about. Part of the reason that experts get a bad name is that they start going off-piste. You know something about community, you know something about cyber law, technology, you know something about the media. Part of the problem if you're an expert is you start opining about every damn thing under the sun and you end up looking like a fool, but you also end up making all experts look like fools. And then the public takes a tremendous revenge. So I guess the model is stick to what you know and shut up about everything else. And allow yourself occasionally to be surprised by these societies.
So what I gather from all of your points is that there is this personal responsibility on an expert to go out and to approach people, to be humiliated. What is that word? Humble. Yeah, of course, humble. To be humble about what you can do. And now to end this part. I would like to give the floor to Professor Ernst Hirsch-Berlin, who is here as a member of the WRR, and he would like to conclude this afternoon for you. Thank you very much.
But there are common standards as well, and they are very much related to the core subject of this afternoon, and that is the value of an open society. And an open society means that requires, I emphasize here again something that was a part of what Michael Ignatieff said this afternoon, requires a constitutional structure that is able to protect the openness, the quality of openness, the free exchange of views within that society. And that's the reason why it was addressed by the panelists, but also by Haroon in his first comments, that requires that we don't accept a situation in which people are within our democratic constitutional system don't recognize anymore that in the end the constitutional system of a free society is a pattern of political and societal behavior that allows us that while we have different backgrounds, different convictions, different religions, different experience in real life, nevertheless come together and accept rules of behavior, policies that are binding for all of us. That is the way in which political discourse, and that's also where our contribution might come into political life, how we have to go hands and forth between generalized viewpoints and specific situations and experiences. And that is, in the end, something that we have learned from the past as well. Several speakers this afternoon emphasized that in the bubbles, in situations where communication is reduced to crying into an echo chamber. That was an expression that Haroon used. That then we might see the other in the end as an enemy, instead as an adversary in political system. Well, we all know that that was the background, ideological background, of what has happened in Europe as in the past as well, and what we see now in the so-called illiberal democracies, including Hungary, Poland, that so far are developing into more intolerance. It is a view that the others are enemies that have to be excluded from the chance to return to power or to be a partner in power. Well, that is something that I think is really important also in the practical sense. Understanding each other means to accept common standards, constitutional standards, including the way in which, for instance, in our constitution, fundamental rights are specified, which might be different from the way in which they are identified in other constitutions. Human rights require democratic politics. They don't replace it. And that means that there is a need, a real and serious need for people who are able to try to fulfill that role in the Scientific Council of Government Policy, to translate into political relevance the insights that we can derive from real life in society, from research, serious academic research. That requires patience, a virtue that has maybe not yet mentioned this afternoon. Patient work, identifying insights, ideas, and like Corinne, I also appreciate to address not only audiences of colleagues, specialists, but also the Katholieke Vrouwengilde in Goorle. And 10 days ago, a group of young people with different religious backgrounds who found each other with shared interest for the value of compassion, interest for the other, interest for other ideas, new outcomes of research. Well, at our level, we try to contribute that to politics in a way that will allow, hopefully, the government and parliament to include different viewpoints, to look around, to take for a moment also the view of the others, the 360 degrees approach, which is so beneficial for human resources departments. It is also beneficial for politics, for the way in which we assist politics. And I think that is a question of virtues as well. We have heard about different virtues this afternoon. Let me add one observation about virtues in the work of an ancient author, Aristotle. For those who did not have a full education in history, Aristotle was in the 4th century before Christ, let's say the Michael Ignatieff of his time in Athens. And he has written a lot about virtues, including virtues in politics. And one of the most interesting observations, in my view, in that part of Aristotle's work is that he, and I think it has often been overlooked, that he said, in the end, the rulers and those who are ruled, the citizens, ought to have basically the same virtues. They have to be able to view things also from the side of a citizen if they are a ruler, and from the side of a ruler if they are a citizen. Well, I think that is, without quoting Aristotle, what we try to do at the Scientific Council of Government Policy, fed by the insights of the people who are gathered here this afternoon. Thank you very much.